Good morning, everybody. My name's Jason Fox. I'm the Senior Technical Evangelist at the FIWARE Foundation. And today we are going to be running a commentary over the basic introduction to FIWARE. Let's see what we're going to find out during this introduction. The idea behind this is it's only a short presentation. It's only going to take about 30 minutes. And this is the standard short presentation that I give whenever I'm introducing FIWARE. And the idea here is to ensure that people understand what the key terms and selling points which I'm trying to get through are, because obviously we want to disseminate what FIWARE is and get people to do it and what have you. We want them to disseminate the information in a standardized format. It's a matter of ensuring that people are saying the right things about what FIWARE actually is, and it's also avoiding saying things which FIWARE actually isn't, or trying to avoid ambiguities. So the introduction for this session had been run in a previous Wednesday webinar. So I'm going to go through the actual webinar itself and talk over myself to explain what I actually meant when I was saying those words. So let's see what I actually said. I start off with a typical introduction. Obviously, I need to say who I am and what this is all about. But I very quickly move on to another learning goals slide. The idea here is that whenever you are doing this sort of thing, you've got to assume there is absolutely no prior knowledge of what FIWARE actually is. And what FIWARE is about. So you've got to start off by defining your terms of what is actually going on. Obviously, it is very important with FIWARE to understand what we mean by context data. Context data depends on what people are saying it actually means, obviously. So you need to understand our definition. The point about our definition is that it is applicable to FIWARE itself. Having done this, we need to explain what is the whole point of it. You've got to have a reasoning behind what's the problem. We have a problem and we have a solution. Now, the problem here is to do with what is going on about smart digital life and what have you. It is summed up much more succinctly in the open source for our smart platform, the Digital Future video, which is also available in the FIWARE system. I'll just turn the volume up on that a little bit.
Revolution. More than half of the world's population has an internet connection, resulting in continuous streams of data generated by the technologies we use in our day-to-day lives. The Internet of Things is impacting virtually all stages of economy and social life, representing a profound change in how humans interact with machines, information, and even each other.
As you can see, we're now starting to understand that this is what context data actually is. Obviously, this is a smarter video than my introductory slides, but you get the idea. We then move on. Idea behind smart life. So this is describing what is context data. It's got to be done in a standard fashion, and I always describe it using the same phrase. Which describe it is that there are three vital questions you need to ask any device or any context entity, and these are: who are you? In other words, you must have some sort of unique ID within your system. What are you? In other words, there should be a type of the entity which will describe the data model which holds the data. And finally, you need to ask, how are you feeling today? In other words, what are the important point there is how you're feeling today will depend on your actual system. Now, this means that we are a generic, neutral way of doing things. It obviously will then depend on what your system is as to what we're actually doing. Let's move on a little bit further. The next fundamental is here. The next fundamental is describing what is the feedback loop for any smart system. So we're still defining our terms. What is context data? What is a smart system? And then explaining why FIWARE is the solution to this chaos.
Analyze these sources and then change the real world. The whole point about a smart solution is that smart solutions are not isolated into a single.
The slide here has got one very important line as well, which is saying we have different sources, including but not limited to IoT. The positioning of FIWARE is further up the stack than just IoT platforms. Indeed, when we get to the simplified architecture diagram, this becomes fairly obvious as to where we're trying to place ourselves. Now, because this is not limited to IoT, it means that multiple systems can be transformed into a FIWARE compatible idea. And also, the flip side also occurs in that if you do not follow this feedback loop system within your application, you are almost certainly not going to need FIWARE as part of your solution. It describes what we are, but it also describes fundamentally what we are not. If you try and use FIWARE as a database, you're doing it wrong. Okay, we have a database and there's a database in there, but it's not what it's all about. It is all about ensuring that you have the latest state of the system and you are in a position to understand what is going on at the moment. Fundamentally, we go on to the context data in some real live solutions. We're now getting on to saying what's going on. These are some real live solutions which involve FIWARE. FIWARE has got a large traction within the smart cities domain. So smart cities is what's actually covered first here, explaining this is a bus, this is a person, this is a citizen claim, this is a whatever. And then we move on to other allied areas. Since agri-food has been a growing area in which FIWARE has been covered, it's the second slide here. And again, once you've got the idea within your domain, you can then move on as necessary. If you want to use these slides, you may want to move the order around, because if you're, say, dealing with an industrial application, you put the industry slide first. The reasoning the three slides were in the way it was, and this is coming up now, is the that is what we're trying to sell you. This is a slide which in one sentence is saying, what are we trying to sell you? We're trying to sell a standard API for accessing context data information. And it doesn't matter what your domain is, but I was saying you need to swap it around as necessary to try and get the impact for what you actually want. It says now, what are some of the advantages of doing this? Obviously, the idea here is that you are allowing entrepreneurs a chance to get in using a standard. And indeed, if we move on further, we can start describing what's going on if how we're actually using it. It's allowing entrepreneurs a chance to get into this system is what this section here is about. Let's move on a little bit faster. This slide here has got the only programming bit in the system. It's got an HTTP request here in the top of the slide. It should be easy enough even to non-technical audiences to explain this is the one bit we're going to get in here. And the bit on the left-hand side is describing what we do relative to actual IoT platforms. It's saying we've got our interface, the thing we're actually selling, we've got our central component, context broker, and then through using this interface, you can get into whatever system you want. It's a generic and open way of doing things. It's a simple example how to check whether the value of a sensor, it's a lamp in this particular case, but it's trying to give it in a fashion that people understand what is the point of all this, is keep it as simple as possible. Moving on to the actual receiving point, the alternative of getting values is putting value, obviously. So once again, it's doing a simple real-world example which people are able to understand. And this is one of the ones which I always use, because when you're trying to get the concepts of FIWARE over the actual ideas, then you need to be able to do it in such a fashion that people can understand what the options actually are. So let's just keep it nice and simple. I'll pause this for a second. Let's just keep it nice and simple and just do a simple water sprinkler or a simple lamp as to what is actually the ideas behind FIWARE. Now, this here is the first slide where we start getting some approvals bodies coming up onto the screen, and it describes two things. It mentions the removal of data silos, in other words, trying to keep your data from elsewhere, but it also starts saying, hey, other people are starting to say this is the right way to do this sort of thing.
And we've been given a rubber stamp as one of the building blocks for connecting Europe facility, which means that someone out there thinks that actually this idea is rather good. It's already got a lot of traction.
This is the point, is that you're not actually trying to say that me as a technical evangelist of FIWARE knows what I'm talking about, saying that other people actually agree with me. It's the whole point is that it's larger than just the person who's trying to sell you this system. It's more a case of there are other bodies out there who actually agree with you, so you can follow the intelligence crowds. In that, if I think it's good, if you think it's good, if he thinks it's good, if she thinks it's good, chances are it's something you might want. This is saying how you can get into the system. This is the avoiding vendor lock-in slide, and
it means you can plug into any system. Similarly, if you have a processing layer which is talking NGSI, it can pass information down to devices which are FIWARE ready, any device, regardless of the actual platform. So
it's a case of saying how generic this whole idea and system is. This is why we're saying we're not a platform, we're linking to other platforms.
So, FIWARE, what are we? FIWARE is promoting a public royalty-free standard for context information management. This is a simple REST API. This is this NGSI v2, which I've mentioned already. And obviously with the v2, you can see that there was a v1.
This is once again defining what the terms are in a little bit more detail. At the top of the hour, it was mentioned what context data management is, what NGSI is. These are terms which an absolute beginner is not familiar with. So there needs to be a little bit of hand-holding here. The ideas of things like REST and JSON and linked data may or may not need to be described when you're doing this, depending on your audience. Now we're going back to it saying there's some more bodies who think this is a good idea. This will depend on which domain you're talking about as to which ones are actually worthwhile talking to you. So in the mobile area, GSMA is a good one to talk about. If you're talking about smart cities, then you've got things like Seth when you can talk about. Similarly, it depends on which of the standards bodies your audience is likely to recognize. Etsy is probably the biggest one of the three on that particular one. NIST or TM Forum are quite large on this one. What I have found is when I am giving this presentation, it's usually the case that people want me to stop and slow down on these slides and we start taking pictures of these slides, because this is the understanding of who actually agrees with FIWARE. Now we're moving on to more domain specific. It goes on to things like who is interested in robotics, who is interested in industrial applications. Once again, the order of this information will depend on the audience you're talking in. The reason what was done the way it was in this slide deck is that this is currently set up as a generic introduction.
Interface for that particular domain, because we're not experts in everything. We're obviously partnering with other systems as necessary. So this is the simple overview as to what the FIWARE platform looks like. It consists of...
This is the standard 5 box. This is describes the architectural divisions which FIWARE is divided into, which should be understandable by any user. I say it's the executive summary. Any more than about 4 or 5 boxes, it starts becoming too complex to understand as an introduction. And it's much easier to say you've got context management in the middle, which is the one thing which we are fundamentally about. And on top of that, you can process the data, and below that, you can retrieve the data. So you've got these 3 layers which are fundamental to any system. Now, the box on the right is basically the multi-layer elements, and the box on the left is deployment elements. Now, this is not a division down into what are known as the chapters of FIWARE, because the chapters are more discrete. It's more a case of understanding the basic area in which they are dealing with. So you are doing things like processing is a chapter, visualization is a chapter, analysis is a chapter, security is a chapter, monetization is a chapter. Some of these are multi-layer, some of them are in an individual layer, and it's easier just to group them into these 4 areas plus deployment. Deployment is always a little bit different because it will depend on your system. Now, having done that, you can then say this is the latest state of FIWARE as a whole. This is where we start introducing the FIWARE catalog. Now, I'll just pause this for a second. The FIWARE catalog is a curated set of software elements which build around NGSI. Curated in that we mean that there are a series of requirements which every single part of FIWARE technology must follow. So it must be open source. It must be able to work with context data. The full list of the requirements is actually in a rather dry document, which is again available on the web as to saying what you need to do and how you need to do it. It means that everything we have here is somehow related to context data. Now, if I go back to that thing at the beginning, the professional video, and come to the end.
And the creation of innovative business models in multi-sided markets. Join us to ensure that standards are driven by the needs of all society, and to ensure that FIWARE will stay free for all, forever.
The whole point about that final phrase is that if it's free, it must be open source. If it's available, it must be open source. The unique selling point here is that we are an open source ecosystem, which means that you can add in your proprietary stuff around these open source things. The FIWARE bit will be free for all forever. doesn't mean that you can't make money out of it, because you can make money out of the other layers within the system. If I go back to here, if you have intellectual property on some sort of complex processing, then you can make money out of selling that. If you have devices which connect to a system which can create FIWARE, you can make money out of that. So there is no problem with trying to say this is free, but this is also something you can make money out of. There is a division between the incubated members and full members. The incubated members here are in the process of fulfilling that huge list of requirements, but they have at least done a minimum set of requirements, whereas the full members are more mature and have got a higher level of understanding. The next few slides thereafterwards start describing what the actual full members do. Now, again, going through the introduction process, one of the things which every FIWARE enabler needs to do is it needs to have a pitch. It needs to have a description of what it does and how does it work around context data. These slides here briefly describe what the problems solved for each of the mature enablers actually are. This isn't quite up to date in that FogFlow is now a full member, so we need to add another one in the slide. Similarly, there are a number of additional incubated enablers which do either similar jobs to the existing full members or something a little bit related, which could be added into this system, and there should be no preference as to whether you are using one of them or using an alternative technology. Provided you are using a context broker in the right fashion, then it's a case of you are okay by us. I don't care which agent you're using. I don't care whether you decide to use OpenMTC to come in and get the information. The top of the slide is saying this is a problem, this is how you can solve it, and then it's just describing what the options are. There are a wide range of technologies which can be covered here to try and do this, solve this problem, and it's obviously growing.
Standards at the IoT level. In other words, we stay on top.
Once again, emphasizing that we are not purely an IoT platform. We're now moving on to individual full elements, like, say, Currento. Currento will be getting the getting context data out into out of a data stream. Now, something like Currento is able to do an awful lot more things than just get context data out. But as far as FIWARE is concerned, that's its role in FIWARE. So that's what's emphasized by the text and the overview. Now, moving on to visualization. Visualization is quite an easy sell. It's very easy to do on slides. You can see what it can do. Not a problem describing what it is. It does a similar job to knowledge, which is the next slide. Now, once again, trying to get this information deep without putting it into a deep level of basis means that you lose a lot of information. Depending on the audience, you may want to spend a lot more time on, say, business intelligence, because they need to understand how that will reflect for them. So if you're doing, say, a cockpit for a city enabler, you do a lot more than that very quick intro I did on knowledge. Each one of these is the basic overview here is near enough just reading over it and just letting people there to read it. There's approximately 60 slides in this deck, if I remember. The idea is to try and make this approximately half an hour long. So you've got about 30 seconds to go over most of these. And once again, you don't want to take too long because you will fail to keep the interest of the various parts of the audience. Describing what the selling point of the CCAN and business data set is. Now, access control is an interesting area in that it is sometimes said that FIWARE is relatively insecure. And the reason behind that is because we are an open system, we don't mandate proper security practices. The idea is that you need to add them in yourself. We encourage proper security practices, and we have elements which are capable of doing that, and there are third-party elements which can also do that. But you cannot rely on every single element in an open system to have the same level of security or require the same level of security. So this is more a case of these are elements you will probably need. You will probably need more. Once again, if we get to the next slide, it will actually show how you can have security between microservices. What this isn't showing is that you also need security outside of the FIWARE domain. The idea that you want to have your devices putting data into your context broker and the passing the information into that IoT agent also needs to be secured. And it won't be secured by the standard FIWARE pet proxy or keylock because it's outside of our domain. This is quite difficult to propose when you are doing a basic introduction. Yes, we have security components. Yes, we are able to secure the area around the context data. But no, we are not doing the end-to-end security just out of the box with nothing to for you to do. You need to take care. Once again, if you have the Linux analogy, it's the case where if you are doing something like Linux, you need to go through a little bit more, be a bit more aware about what you're doing than if you're, say, using a Mac directly where it just works. You know, you have to understand what the compromises here are. Now, moving on to the architecture diagrams. The architecture diagrams are a repeat, again, across several domains, where it is typical that the context data management layer is highlighted on screen. You can see this is basically a repeat of the 5 box which we had earlier on. And the idea here is to try and translate that simple 5 box diagram into each domain and say, hey, this is how it would work in a real life system. I'll just briefly go through the next two because again, it's once again it's the same thing. We then move on to some real life success stories. There are multiple success stories across different domains, and it's a matter of finding, okay, here's an industrial one, here's an agricultural one, and so on and so forth. If you were, say, doing a purely agricultural if you're doing a purely agricultural pitch, then obviously you'd want several agricultural ones rather than having 5 smart cities. You want to try and make these are available for the audience in question. So because this is the generic intro, there's a bit of smart cities, there's a bit of industry, and this one is a bit of agriculture. Once again, you can see that the different areas the FIWARE concept is applicable to the different verticals. There is a nice example with this, the slide which you just passed, is that it's quite easy to describe animals as autonomous units, and therefore as also autonomous units which are have a monetary value and therefore are worth monitoring. Because you can see how you can make money. Once again, this is going through health. It's going through a wide range of different options. And finally move on to the systems approach, where you are able to get data coming into multiple context brokers. The final part of the introduction slide is, I'll just move on to that a little bit there.
From, say, a silo, a pest management system, and so on and so forth.
Right, so the final part of the introduction, having gone through the various different bits and pieces, saying, we are a community, we're open source, blah, 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 is to actually define what FIWARE is. It's quite difficult because some people misuse the word FIWARE. You should be quite careful defining the difference between the FIWARE Foundation, the actual FIWARE technologies, the FIWARE Marketplace, the FIWARE Lab, FIWARE iHubs, FIWARE Mundus. There are all sorts of different elements to FIWARE, which is the overall initiative, compared to how do we get the actual solutions of how do people make money out of it? What is the test bed for it? That's the FIWARE Lab. What is the initiatives globally? That is FIWARE Mundus. Each one of these has got a one sentence or two sentence description. What is the role of the iHubs? Where can you get more information about FIWARE? Where can you get money to promote FIWARE acceleration? This is a summary here describing what the various parts actually are and how they differ. I usually slow down and try and explain what these actually are before finally coming to a halt right at the end. Now the slides here describe a summary of what FIWARE is and what NGSI is and what the smart solutions are, which I assume you already know. However, I will just emphasize what's going on within the Evangelists domain. FIWARE is an open source initiative defining a universal set of standards for context data management. This is a one-sentence elevator pitch of FIWARE. The highlighted points are: it's open source, it's free to use, it's an initiative, it's got a variety of various elements to it, and it is trying to create a set of standards, which is what this NGSI business is all about, for context data management. If you're not interested in the current state of your system, you're not interested in us. Not all parts of a smart system are necessarily context data, but they may well be held within the context broker in the form of, say, registrations, or linked data. This is where the FIWARE data models come in that if you have, for example, a database which is got the information for when the next 3 buses are turning up, that does not translate very easily to context data, in that it will be changing depending on your calculation and algorithm. However, you could actually have a registration or a linked data saying, I can then get the information in a standardized format following a standard data model, so that I would be able to retrieve that information or calculate that information and then pass that on to other users as if it were the context data. There's a difference between the two. So that is the elevator pitch. And the key takeaways are as follows. If you're trying to sell FIWARE, FIWARE is free open source technology. There is another slide which isn't in this deck, which shows software development as a club sandwich. You have various different layers which you are trying to get avoid creating from scratch. You take frameworks to provide 90% of your infrastructure. You take existing devices to get your readings. You don't build them for yourself. You get existing frameworks to create your software. You don't write it from scratch. Of course, that way you get things like free maintenance as well, which is rather useful. So this is trying to sell to, say, software developers, saying, we want to make your life easy by doing most of the work for you. FIWARE is a focused solution based around context data. I emphasize it once again, you only need FIWARE if you care about context. Having defined what context actually is, it's a lot easier to say, yes, this is what your issue is. When I have been dealing with startups trying to use FIWARE, the first question I always ask is, what is your context? What are your entities? What's changing? How are we getting information about this system? That is fundamental to get into your context broker, and then you can process the stuff there afterwards. So it's always based around context. It's always based around that loop of the feedback loop so that we can get information back in. The other components exist to facilitate the flow of the context data. If you go back to looking at the FIWARE catalog, you can see that they are able to interact with the context somehow. If it doesn't interact with the context, it can't be considered as part of the catalog. The context data is broader than just IoT platforms. If you just say we're an IoT platform, you've got it wrong. The idea is that you can get information from elsewhere. The usual example I give is getting a weather forecast to decide whether or not you're going to get your water sprinkler to turn on or not. Now, this means that because you are augmenting your context with information from other systems, you are doing more than just retrieving IoT readings, changing IoT readings, and pushing stuff out of IoT. And indeed, it would be perfectly possible to have a valid context database solution which had nothing to do with IoT, if that was your product. FIWARE is standards driven. This is the third key point, is that we need to ensure that people are able to use this sort of thing and continue to use this sort of thing because it's applying to a standard. It avoids vendor lock-in, and it means that there's an easy entry to markets. If you're talking to big companies, they want to get their suite of devices to be able to talk FIWARE, because then they can pitch, use all our devices for your system. If you're talking about small companies, you can say, okay, because there are solutions which are based on FIWARE, I can just have an agile solution which just deals with this particular bit of the NGSI interface, and then I can make money out of my intellectual property, which is around that sort of thing. And the third point there is it's verified and accepted by other standards bodies. So you're not just listening to me saying this is what it is. You're listening to Etsy, you're listening to TM Forum, and so on and so forth. Various big names in the standards world who can actually talk about it. Key terms. The key terms are the FIWARE this, the FIWARE that, the FIWARE whatever. I said what the FIWARE is. It's the initiative. The FIWARE catalog is a curated framework of open source platform components. It is a case where it must be free. It must be open source. It must work directly with the context broker and therefore indirectly with all the other generic enablers. And of course, you need to be able to get hold of versions which are compatible with each other, which is why we're the so-called FIWARE release. But another point which people sometimes don't pick up on unless you emphasize is that it is pick and mix. If there is an element you don't want to use, or you have a solution which doesn't use our existing element, there's nothing wrong with using your stuff. We're not throwing everything at you. If you've got something which you've already got a stream processing element, we don't say, oh, you must go through Corrento to get your context data out. No, you can do your own solution. If you have specific security requirements, we don't say you must use Keyrock for your identity management. If you've got something else, you can use that already, provided it is able to talk with the context broker or surround the technologies of the context broker. We don't mind what you're using. FIWARE is trying to sell the standard rather than trying to sell the individual elements. Obviously, the individual elements make your life easier and are there to solve problems themselves. So, if you've got, I don't know, a solution which needs to use Sigfox, then use the Sigfox agent. It's trying to help you along. It's accelerating the development of your solution because it's trying to solve problems, but it's not trying to get in your way. Having got a solution and you're trying to get some cash back for all your development that you've done, you then move into the FIWARE Marketplace. FIWARE Marketplace is to do with commercial solutions. This obviously contrasts with things like the FIWARE Lab, which is a test bed for until you're coming up to being a commercial solution. And there are the various different degrees in which you are FIWARE compatible. You can be a FIWARE solution end to end. You can be FIWARE ready technologies, which means somehow from my device in the real world, I can talk to the context broker either directly or indirectly. And there are other services being offered. The third point, which here is the difference between FIWARE and the FIWARE Foundation. FIWARE Foundation is the legally independent body for promoting and protecting FIWARE. In other words, all the technology and the stuff around it. So the point being here is that we in the FIWARE Foundation are generally not creating all the software ourselves. It is the contributors who are adding to the software and the FIWARE mission. We are making sure that everyone plays fair. We're the referee in the middle. We are promoting stuff by doing things like webinars and what have you. It's a case that FIWARE Foundation is a neutral referee defining and promoting the standard, and other companies are the ones which are making business out of using this standard. So in summary, that is all the key points which need to be emphasized when you are pitching FIWARE as an introduction to other users.